Wonderful. So we're going to begin, and first off, again, I would also like to restate my gratitude to the Assyrian Cultural Foundation, who very, very kindly have funded the open access to my book, Triumph and Betrayal, which is officially out on the 21st of April of this coming month, which I'm jolly happy about. Apparently, obviously I'm here in Chicago, but apparently the first copies of it reached my university library 2 days ago. I got a rather strange email about that. Anyway, so let's begin properly. And as you can see, I've got the rather dramatic title here of The Lost Kings of Assyria. And this is because, well, I'd like to shake things up a little bit. This is somewhat historical, there's something of a historical moment, if you like, because, in fact, 2 of these kings were presented last year in Helsinki at the Rencontre, and the third has not been presented at all yet publicly. So this is the first time you're going to see all 3 of them in one go. And so I'd like to begin with this rather curious question. Why weren't more Neo-Assyrian kings murdered? This sounds a little bit strange. You know, we have already a very famous murder. Sennacherib is killed by his son, probably Ardamilisu, but there's some debate about that. But if we look at, for example, the Romans, this other sort of great paradigmatic empire we like to think of, they were really killing each other. If you watch I, Claudius or something like that, one of those programs, or Rome, you'll see how often they were killing one another, or at least trying to oust one another from power. And when you actually look, of course, here at all of this is during a period of time when Rome was actually expanding. So this isn't the decay of an empire, as we always imagine, they're stabbing each other, whatever, as the empire crumbles. This is actually the sign of a healthy empire, that people are trying to fight to get to the top, if you like. And indeed, if we then look very good at the Assyrian example, we think first, of course, of the late Neo-Assyrian period. And here, of course, I already mentioned the murder of Esarhaddon. Although, of course, I've marked in red the kings who reached the top by irregular means, whether violence, skullduggery, or other. And the green ones are those who seem to, at least as far as we can tell, have gotten to the top peacefully. Yes, and this is while the empire's ready in its biggest extent. However, the question I've been posing myself the past 10 years, well, it's rather crystallized in the past 2 or 3 years, but I was always thinking about to begin with, was how do things work on the first half of the Assyrian Empire? So this is obviously the period in which, as you can see here, it begins with a phase in which Assyria is very weak at the end of what we still call the Dark Age, and then it expands outwards, of course, once again. Oh God, my voice has gotten louder. Hopefully I'm still intelligible if I hold it about here. At this point then, during what I call the entr'acte, an in-between period, Assyria reaches its old size during the Middle Assyrian period. And at this point then, it stays like this for about 100 years in a holding pattern. And then it expands once again to become the big empire that we all know during what one calls the late Neo-Assyrian period. However, when we look at this early Neo-Assyrian period, the strangest thing is, first off, what's been reconstructed so far is that there was a completely peaceful succession of one king, father to son, father to son, father to son, for 8 generations, or 190 years, which seems a little bit unlikely, considering all the killing later. And if one then in turn has a look at the sort of the second half then thereafter, things do get a bit messier by this in-between period I call the entr'acte, where one sees here that in fact there are some killings happening. Most clearly you can see here in red there's a little civil war which breaks out for a while, and then once again Tiglath-Pileser does kill his way up to the top in a rebellion at the end. And you can see there's actually a lot of interesting side sort of characters, if you like, during this period, most famously Shamuramat, Semiramis, who probably is Babylonian princess in my opinion, but that's the topic of another lecture, but also various sort of high officials, sort of the Turtanu, who was the big generalissimo of the Assyrian Empire, is also more or less calling the shots, which is why you have this sequence of brothers which occurs. Again, a little bit suspicious that this happens. One brother dies, then another, and it's this big high official that's essentially putting them one after another on the throne. However, as I've said, I find this all a little bit fishy, and so my question I ask as Ashurbanipal for one moment is, could there have been more sort of Assyrian kings and we just don't really have the evidence because they didn't reign particularly long or similar? And in fact, I do think that there's good reason for thinking this. The first is that we actually don't often ask ourselves why we have the list of kings that we have today. For the Assyrians. It's mostly based on the Assyrian king list, but ultimately this is just a more or less arbitrary decision which we made after the First World War. Now you can see here in this slide, prior to the First World War, if we look at, for example, what Walter Andre published here, you can see that the numbering was very different. Tiglath-Pileser was Tiglath-Pileser IV, Ashurnasirpal was Ashurnasirpal III. And what happens is that there was a big war, the First World War, in which both I suffered, I didn't suffer, or only I was definitely not born when this occurred, although I once actually got a corona test in Turkey, and they put my date as 1900. I got asked if I was at Gallipoli, but that's another story. Anyway, to get back to it, what then occurred, of course, is not only did Europe and European Assyriologists suffer, in fact, one of the most talented historians of the time, Ernst Klauber, died in the first weeks of the war. Of course, also the Assyrian people suffered terribly during the Saipho. However, the point is that at the end of this, there was a huge confusion in which academics more or less could not catch up with each other's academic material. And what occurred then is that Olmsted, in a very famous history of Assyria, essentially then gave the canonical list of kings as they are now. And since then, we've just accepted it, possibly because many of his critics had died in the war. Anyway, to continue then, that's the first point where I say, do things really work? And if we carry on, then the second point is that we all agree that there's a Shalmaneser, Salmanu Ashered V, also known as Ululaya. But when you actually look at things, the interesting thing is that there's practically no evidence for him. There's some references in the Bible. There's some points in king lists or in the eponym chronicles. However, all we have are 9 lovely little bronze lion weights with his name on them, and he doesn't even give the name of his father. So theoretically, we could date them to another Shalmaneser. We simply date him to this latest one because, as you saw in the lovely talk by Jonathan Falk beforehand, there's also ones of Sharu Ukin of Sargon afterwards, which are very similar. So we put them up with the last one. But there's actually not much reason to, and if so, we'd have practically no evidence for a Shalmaneser whatsoever, apart from what the Bible told us, and a couple of sources, most of which aren't actually Assyrian. The other point that's tied into this is that even when we look at the most famous murder I talked to you about, of course, the murder in the temple of 681 BC, the sources are amazingly scant when one looks. There's 1 or 2 letters that hint at it in one way or another, and then on the other side there's obviously the good book, as we've already seen. There's some references in later Babylonian sources, and there's one very odd mention in the inscription of Esarhaddon, which is very ambiguous as to what exactly it should mean. So once again, if we don't happen to have the proper sources, is what I'm trying to get at, then a king can easily disappear from view. So with that, let's move on to a final point of my sort of intro, my spiel to you, and that is that, of course, then, if we try and compare with reconstructions of other little kingdoms during this period, as far as we can go, and this is my newest reconstruction of a little kingdom on the Middle Euphrates called Suhu during the first millennium BC, they also had situations where brother succeeded brother, and probably people were being killed off. Certainly the ruler Tabnea was murdered in Assyria out of nowhere, because one of his descendants actually mentions this. Anyway, so with all of that, we look at it, and here's then my first proposition to you before we go into the evidence, namely then, why couldn't there be more Neo-Assyrian kings than we previously thought? And the answer is, I think it actually, in my opinion, is quite likely, considering that most empires which are doing well have a lot of kings that often die very quickly, only after a year or so. So with that, it's time for us to begin actually investigating the evidence itself. And first off, we have a little bit of methodology here. How would we find a new Assyrian king if we were looking for one? Now, the answer is, of course, there's a big combination of sources, as I've already touched upon. I already mentioned in terms of Shalmaneser V, how much evidence we have for him or not. Here you see we have to combine all of this, including, obviously, previous opinions of scholars, to get to our conclusion. However, I'd like to turn things a bit on their head and say that, in fact, we have to turn to 2 types of evidence. The first is the historical evidence. And here, if we're trying to look for little kings that ruled for a little while, we have to look for things like erasures, who might have been removed from history. We have to look at bits of chronology that don't make sense, where years don't work out. We have to look for gaps, years where we don't know anything about, and often, this occurs more often than you think in Assyrian inscriptions, they change the counting of their years subsequently. So at the beginning of their reign, they say in my first year, and then later on, this thing has been moved into the year before their first, their sort of 0 year, the original year before the next cycle of the Assyrian calendar starts. There's all sorts of different things going on. There's also strange things like in the eponym lists, when a new king comes, you draw a line within the list. And sometimes there are strange lines in the list where there shouldn't be a king. So there's all sorts of strange things that show that phantom kings could be floating around. And of course, the point is, the other thing we have to remember is the rules of Assyrian kingship, which I've given to you. This has to be a male and also notionally of blood descent. There seems to be, probably it's connected to the priestly duties involved in being a king, which we heard about already this morning from Shane Isaiah. The other point is they can't be eunuchs until right at the end of the empire. There's a eunuch who manages it very briefly, not very successfully. The other point, of course, is that the Assyrian king has to be crowned at the capital of Ashur. He can't become king otherwise. This is why the last sort of Ashur-uballit at the end of the empire is actually a crown prince, because Ashur has been lost and he never gets to have his coronation. And finally, the Assyrians sadly were not democratic in a sense. We'll see this whenever the country was beginning to go badly, they would try to replace the current king with a new one. They wouldn't say, let's all start an anarcho-syncretic commune or similar. They'd just find another king to replace him. So with all those rules, let's get to our first example of what I think is a new king. And this is a very strange land grant from 762 BC during a civil war, and this is not my discovery, it's the discovery of Eckhard Fram, who already has this in a lovely footnote in his book on Assyria, hence it's citable, as it were, and we both presented our respective kings last year at Helsinki, so sort of have his blessing on this. I am not nicking his work, as one says in English. And here we see, this is a very strange document which has been known about for more than 100 years. And here you can see this is a land grant. So a king gives a tract of land to one of his followers, a high official or similar. And when we look at this, we see that the top is very broken, but there's a name. And this has always been reconstructed as Adad-Nirari, and then it would have to be Adad-Nirari III. However, this is very strange because, of course, Adad-Nirari III had been dead for more than 20 years at the time, by the time this was written. So it's very strange that we always thought this was the case, but we did. And very oddly, further on in the text, one actually finds a Tiglath-Pileser there, written at the bottom. And so Eckhard Fram put 2 and 2 together and realized, something does not make sense here, though he was somewhat tentative about it. However, we see that it's sealed with the king's seal of the king killing a lion, and it's stamped there twice very hard. So whoever was doing this certainly thought he was king. And when we look at when this was sealed, it was in 762 BC. And here we see, rather remarkably, that this is right in the middle of probably the worst decade Assyria experienced, at least until its collapse. And here we see we have literally disasters of biblical proportions. There are 2 plagues which sweep through Assyria and probably actually kill the entire family of the reigning Assyrian king, Ashur-dan III. Ashur-dan III. If my reconstruction is correct, you will see all the reasoning in my book. However, of course, the bones from the Nimrod tombs have not been genetically studied to see whether everyone in this coffin actually belongs to the same family, but it would make sense because they die in 2 waves 6 years apart from one another, which is exactly what the plagues have. And the bones have been moved around multiple times, which implied they've been buried very hastily to begin with, probably in a plague, and then later put in a nice shiny coffin at the end by probably Tiglath-Pileser. The last Tiglath-Pileser. There was also an eclipse in 762 BC, which is this famous Bur-Sagale eclipse you might have heard of, which all of the chronology for the first millennium is more or less sort of centered around this eclipse. And interestingly, this seems to have started this civil war, which then for 6 years, roughly 6 years afterwards, raged in Assyria. And this probably actually inspired the Jonah narrative, which one knows from the Bible, where Jonah has to go to Nineveh to convert everyone, because there must have been, I believe, very genuine religious terror and panic during this era. So with that, that's the chaos in which this document was drafted, which is very odd when things business as usual, no, that this carries on. And here in this case, it has been pointed out, oh dear, the cuneiform signs are not legible. I should have used my laptop, not the other one. But I do promise you, it's definitely the name Tiglath-Pileser, in fact, which stands there. Those lovely mystery signs. I forgot to realize you have to get this plug-in thing, which then does the cuneiform text. Yes, that was a bit dumb there. Anyway, to get back to it, though, Eckhard Fram argues this, and it's very good. And hence, we now, as Ashurbanipal once again, can ask then, is it possible that there is a new Tiglath-Pileser, a Tiglath-Pileser free? I should like then to say yes, and some of this evidence is Eckhard Fromm's and some of it is mine, which I've also accrued. Notice in the book of Jonah, for example, the king is not the king of Assyria, he is the king of Nineveh. And one rather wonders, is this because maybe the king only controlled Nineveh at this point? If so, which king? Another interesting point tied to this is that there is a mysterious ruling for the year just before the eclipse, which shows that a new king should have gotten onto the throne at that time, according to rules, but no king's name is there, which is very strange. Obviously, this civil war was huge. It led to the destruction of Guzana's palace at the time. A new one was put on top of it. If you look in another eponym list, you'll see that there's actually a very weird remark where the king's name should be, Ashur-dan III, showing that possibly from the beginning of his reign, he already wasn't accepted by everyone. So this is quite a reasonable proposal, I would say, and there's another lovely document which actually demonstrates that Ashur seems to have been reconquered after the beginning of this rebellion by 762, probably a couple of months after the other document we have was drafted. So this can be our first new Assyrian king. Obviously, the point is that I have to prove multiple ones so that the idea that there are more Assyrian kings sort of works. So the evidence is somewhat cumulative. However, I think it's quite solid because his name does appear in a document and it fits a whole load of events at the time, including a civil war. So presumably, things have been going so badly that the uncle, because of course he's listed as the son of Shamshi-Adad V, then somehow is brought out of his retirement to become king and to challenge his own nephew for supremacy. So that's our first king. We're doing well because it's only 17 minutes I've spoken to you. Let's move on to our next king. And this one has not really been discussed at all publicly yet. And we see this on a stele from a place called Tel Abtar, which is in the Wadi al-Tharthar. And if we look at this, this is a rather unusual stele in which one has a eunuch on the front of it, no king or anything like that, just the eunuch. I'm looking at, oddly enough, some Babylonian symbols, and Marduk's mentioned in the text and not Ashur, which is rather curious. However, what's interesting is that this is placed then right in the Wadi Farfa, as I mentioned, in an area controlling communication up and down, probably during this period in which Assyria is still in a chaotic state and is not expanding, which we call the Entracte. However, I call it the Entracte. However, the dating of this remains extremely controversial, and it's because of something where, once again, we would be looking at the cuneiform signs, but I've realized, of course, I didn't get the plug-in on this other laptop, so instead you're seeing question marks. However, you're going to have to trust me on this one. Essentially, the name of the king mentioned briefly in this text has been erased and a new one has been put on top. And the old name, it's still visible in the photographs, is Shalmaneser, and this has been erased, and the name Tiglath-Pileser has been put on top. So there's been a debate about this for more than 100 years where people have said, well, who is the Shalmaneser and who is the Tiglath-Pileser? And we have essentially three options. We have number one, which is, of course, that it's Shalmaneser IV, and then for some reason Tiglath-Pileser once the third, now the fourth, if we follow my new Tiglath-Pileser numbering system, as it were. But the one who takes over and makes Assyria a big empire, his name is then put on it. But the question is, why? Because there's about 30 years or more in between these two kings. So why exactly would you then replace this old name with this new name? There doesn't seem to be any reason for this, and hence a lot of people said this is not plausible. The other theory is that this is then Shalmaneser V, this other one, but the problem is Shalmaneser V came after Tiglath-Pileser the fourth or the third, however you like. So then this would be impossible without the use of a time machine. So then people have argued that then it was actually Sargon, our Sharu-Ukin, who then put the name of his father there instead of Shalmaneser V. But why? It doesn't make any sense. Why would you bother? Also, tied to this, and no one's talked about, is that the writing, the cuneiform writing, is in exactly the same scribal style, and it must have happened almost exactly after it was written. As a result, we can then potentially pose another answer. I've added at the bottom there a little dog end. It could be Shalmaneser IV and this new Tiglath-Pileser we just talked about in the rebellion. However, that actually doesn't make much sense either. So let's look at this art historically. Now, the eunuch wears a very beautiful gown, you can see here, it's a type of Phrygian textile which was immensely popular. You can see some other examples here. These are dated examples. And during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser, if we like, the fourth, this was all the rage. Everyone was trying to wear this very beautiful tartan fabric, which I recommend. If you're going to make another statue of another Assyrian king, then choose like Tiglath-Pileser and give him like this really nice Phrygian fabric because it's nice. And essentially, it can be dated to this period. But what's interesting is that art historically, if we then look at what is the beginning and end of this fabric fad, we see that nobody seems to be wearing it in the reign of Shalmaneser IV. And in the reign of Shahrukhin, only the king wears it. And if you've been to the Oriental Institute, or now it's called something else, if you've been there, then you will see exactly this relief there, and you can look close up, which I did yesterday, and see this lovely Phrygian textiles. So it seems that this must have been made between 750 and 720. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense art historically that this guy is wearing this clothing. The other point is, there's a eunuch on the front of this stele and not a king. This is extremely unusual. There's only one other example of this happening. This is from a place called Anashöyük, and the dating of this stele has also been a source of much debate. However, two interesting points suggested a very specific time. Firstly, that it's not finished. So whoever had it created, the divine symbols hadn't been put on it, and hence it wasn't done. However, it's also defaced. So this means that while they were making the relief, somebody else came in and started smashing the thing and removing the name, by the way, of the patron and leaving only the name of the underling who's actually on the stele. And so you can actually place this very easily because when Tiglath-Pileser takes over in the end, the last Tiglath-Pileser, and creates this big empire, he smashes everything associated with Shamshi-Ilu, the previous eunuch who's been in charge. So we can date this exactly to 746 to 745. With all this, then, we can ask, might there be an Assyrian king just for 1 year? And remember, if their kings are only there for about 1 or 2 years, they wouldn't end up in any of the king lists because it wouldn't have been worth the effort, who reigned just there, squeezed in between 747 and 745 BC. And if so, he'd have to be called Shalmaneser, because his name is such, before it was erased. Well, the answer is there's a lot of evidence that actually points to this. Firstly, that when one looks at the Assyrian eponym lists, the rulings, the lines which are supposed to show when there's a new king, are all over the place. I've shown them behind you in that diagram. Nobody seems to have been certain when exactly the reign of Tiglath-Pileser actually started. And if you look at them, it suggests that actually there is a brief king in between, which some lists accept as having been a king and others left out. There's also, very weirdly, a big problem that's always existed is that in one version of, in the king list, Tiglath-Pileser is listed as the son of Ashur-Nerari V. However, in his own inscriptions, in one brick, he calls himself the son of an Adad-Nerari. People have said this is a scribal mistake, but the signs for Adad and Ashur look completely different, so it's unlikely. Rather, if we had a phantom king in between who was the son of Ashur-Nerari and then got rubbed out of the lists, then a scribe could confuse him and with the other one. This is how it would occur. On top of this, there's also a missing year to Kulti-Apal-Sharat. That should be a 4. Look at me, very naughty. I haven't followed my own new numbering rules. In fact, this big Tiglath-Pileser, he says that he ruled for 19 years, but when you look, only 18 are accounted for. There's an extra ghost year in there, which again could be when a king had been occupying this. But there is a final smoking gun, ladies and gentlemen. I have not left you without a solid piece of evidence. And here, in fact, it is that in the Ptolemaic canon, the list of kings of Babylonia, which begins in 747 with Nabu-Nasir, who's listed as Nabu-Nasseros, and goes all the way down, in some cases, down to Darius or Alexander. But in whichever one it is, it always starts with Nabu-Nasir as Nabu-Nasseros, and then, weirdly, it always says Nabu-Nasseros, who is also Shalmaneser, also called Shalmaneser. This is very weird, because the Shalmaneser we're thinking of, the later one, if we take my hypothetical Shalmaneser as a possibility, is already in the list, and he's called Ululaya. So he would have to be appearing twice, and there'd be no explanation for why this year, 747, is connected with this Nabu-Nasseros. However, if the scribe who had compiled the Ptolemaic canon in Greek had been using multiple cuneiform sources, and one of them was a list of kings of Babylonia and Assyria next to one another, listed parallel, then he could easily have confused Nabonassar with Salmanassar, and hence, in turn, have made this confusion. So this is more or less a smoking gun for the existence of the Shalmaneser. He's been more or less erased from history because he only ruled for probably about 1 year, maybe 1 year and 3 months. So with that, we would have another king, which we would pop in there. We'd have to do a little bit more renumbering, I'm afraid. So the final king that I'm going to properly explain to you, and this is the longest example because it requires the most work to get there, and I'm sorry, it must be a little bit exhausting and tasking for you to hear so technical an argument, but I felt that either I explain it all to you, or you just take my word from the very beginning, and then this wouldn't be an academic talk, it'd be some sort of self-help coaching sort of thing, but about Assyria. I guess that could occur if you're Assyrians. Anyway, to get back to it then, in fact, we're going to talk about a final very strange example. This one's the most mysterious, but I think the most fun. And this is located in Asher today, and it's in what's called the sort of the Stilenreihen, the sort of rows of eponym steles which occur. As you might know, Assyria had this really cool setup where the years were named after high officials. And so each would take his turn, the year would be named after him. And kings also got their own stele there, where they would then appear thereupon. And this was like put in a really nice line, as you can see here. Maybe in the late New Assyrian period, it doesn't matter when, somebody arranged all these stele in a line. And among this line, there's a very weird couple of stele. And if we look closer, they look like this. I'm very grateful. These are the old excavation photos, which Stefan Mal very kindly made available to me. If we look closer, it's even more mysterious. Sadly, these photographs aren't all that good. But we see that one stele is lying on top of another. If we look closer, something very odd. It looks like a statue of a king with another stele stuck right on top of it. And sorry, there's some German there explaining it. I didn't feel like translating Walter Andre this morning, so we left it as it is. This is what Andre reconstructs this statue as. And as you can see, it's a stele, so it has an inscription on the middle. It's being used like a stele. But when you look close, the bizarre thing is that this used to be an Assyrian king, very obviously. It's got all the traits, and we have to imagine it would have originally looked like one of these splendid examples of a king. However, you can see it's a blockier, much older sort of version. Quickly, so that you don't think that I'm making this all up, here are the best excavation photos which exist of this stele. Unfortunately, it's lost today. And you can see the little, for example, the fringes. He must have been wearing a hat, and the little tassels are falling down. Also, in turn, you can see the divine symbols on his chest, which only the king would have worn, so he must well be a king. You see a lovely outline of his beard. And, of course, in turn, he seems to be holding the gamlu, the sort of ritual sickle, and also in his other arm, he would have had like a mace, much as I'm holding the microphone right now. And one can then, from all this, we get a king who looks more or less like this. I'm not a good artist. This was the best I could do. But this is this king who must have existed. And the next point is, well, there's a couple. Firstly, this is absolutely enormous. You can see here, this is very huge, which is unusual because Assyrian statues, there's only one that is super life size, which may occur. Maybe from Ashurnasirpal II, there's some debate. However, it's very unusual to have such a giant statue of oneself in Assyria. Assyrian kings seem to have been quite grounded. Normally they're about life size, or a little bit smaller than life size. So this is very unusual, and this is something which we associate with the West, and might also point to an early date when there was a lot of influence from there. And one sees then in turn, even stranger, as I mentioned, there's an inscription on its chest. And this shows the culprit, the person who must have destroyed this statue and turned it into a stele, and is none other than Adad-nirari II. And one sees here, I know it's a little bit broken, there is enough for this to be worked out from all of this. And the question is, why would Adad-nirari II have taken a king's statue, beheaded it, worn down the sides to make it look like a stele, put very crudely in its chest his own inscription, and left it on the row of steles? Well, the answer is that there are other cases of Assyrian kings who use bits of old masonry or pillars as sort of trophies and put their own inscriptions on them. So there's two there. So he's trying to lord it over somebody, When you think about it, who could it be? Well, a previous king. Now, the problem here is that Adad-nirari II always mentions his father Ashur-dan. He seems to have really loved his father, so he couldn't have killed his father off and destroyed the statue. It must have been somebody else. Question is, who? Well, that's what we're going to try to answer now. So just to sort of clarify again, so that we get it, now this is the stage it went through. It was a lovely, nice statue of an Assyrian king, really good. And then what occurred is that it was all smashed up, turned into stele, then it was stuck somewhere else, and then finally another big stele fell on top of it, and that's how Walter Andre found it. And I think it must have been probably the case that it was an elder brother of Adad-nirari, as I've mentioned, and that it must be to have humiliated this person. So when we look, we see, and this is very technical, so please bear with me for a second, that I talked about the list of eponymates one has at the beginning of one's reign. Normally there's a set order, but in the case of Adad-nirari II, the order is completely muddled up, and there's a guy who's not very important who's listed as the next eponym along. This would be potentially someone who might have helped him out if he had had a putsch or if he had fought a civil war. And in fact, this same character is often seen later from really, he's attested down into the reign of Ashur-natsir-apli, still being rewarded as a high official. So probably this chap rather helped him out. Now there's another point here, and this is a very complicated point, so you'll have to go a little bit on faith, which is that a school student at Sultan Tepe, which is probably ancient Huzurina, near the end of the Assyrian Empire, was given a school task one day. He had to copy out these lists of eponyms, so the name for each year. And he did it twice very, very badly. But the dates are very interesting because in one case, he copies out from, I think it is, yes, Adad-nirari the third, all the way down to a chap called Sidki-ilu. And this is the year before this other rebel Tiglath-Pileser would have appeared, who was fighting the civil war. So it shows that the teacher had said, copy out every eponymate from Adad-nirari to Tiglath-Pileser. Then on the same text, he copies it out again, but this time it's from Adad-nirari III down to the last Tiglath-Pileser. So this shows, by the way, incidentally, that the Assyrians didn't number their own kings in their heads. They just said so-and-so, son of so-and-so. But it also shows that once again, we have Adad-nirari is seen as the beginning of these lists of eponyms. There's only one text that goes earlier in the eponyms, and it means that possibly he made himself the beginning of history, if you see what I mean. Anyway, to jump through it, because this is heavy stuff, he actually mentions in turn that he was transformed when he became king, and he was given a brand new, really important name, Adad-nirari. And this is interesting because normally if you're crown prince, if you're supposed to be the successor, you get your name before you're king. But he gets it after he's king, after he's enthroned himself, which again suggests that he actually was a usurper. And yes, there's a little bit more we can say about that, but instead, I'd like to move on to who it is that he then would have ousted. And here there's a very mysterious text. I'm sorry, this is the last big nasty text I'm going to inflict on all of you, and then we're all done. We can wash our hands of this awful textual business. And this is a very unusual text. It's a copy of an inscription which must have gone on the silver beer vessel of the god Ashur. So this is sort of the holy grail, if you like, as it were, of Assyrian stuff. If Indiana Jones were looking for an Assyrian object, like the lovely silver beer vessel would be quite a good one. And what's interesting about this text is that it really lists every previous king who has restored this beer vessel. And when we look, this is published by Eckhard Fromm, by the way, once again, one sees here that it's very odd. In fact, it mentions the history of the beer vessel. The beer vessel, the silver beer vessel, was made by Tukulti-Ninurta I. Then it was restored by someone called Ashur-uballit. No mention that he's king, just says Ashur-uballit. After it had broken, then it breaks again, and then Tukulti-Ninurta II restores it. There's only one problem. There's no King Ashur-uballit between these two Tukulti-Ninurtas. So what can be going on? What could it be? Well, notice he's also not called king. His name is just there. So you think, oh, well, then it must be a normal person called Ashur-uballit. But here, no, that cannot be the case, as we're going to see, because royal names were only for kings during this period. So It's rather suspicious. But anyway, this is the process we see of it. It must have been made, melted down inscription, made, melted down inscription, and so forth. And we see at the end, it also mentions that the next king along has to melt it down and make an inscription out of it again, and mentions my royal forefathers in the plural. However, we've seen only one of the previous guys is mentioned as king. The other has no title. Rather strange. And you could just say my royal forefather, couldn't you, in the singular? So as a result, the blessings, by the way, are also for someone who would be king. So this suggests that, in fact, everyone who made it was a king. The first guy who made the vessel, then the second guy who restored it, who mysteriously doesn't have a royal title, and then Kultinuer the second who finished it. Anyway, that's a long business, but here we are. We're almost at the end of it. And as I said, Eckhard Fromm originally suggested that this was a non-royal individual. However, there is nobody non-royal with the name Ashur-uballit attested until the 7th century BC, right at the end of the Assyrian Empire. Prior to that, they seem to keep this royal name taboo. You're not allowed to have the name of a king because it's a special name. So that would be what it is. But there's a few other points, as I've mentioned as well, of course, and that, among other things, if you're restoring the most precious sacred vessel of Ashur, you probably have to be a king. A few other points here. This is rather funny. There's actually a lovely text from the end of the empire where one chap who lives in the Tur-Abdin, ancient Kashiari, decides to name his child Ashurbanipal for fun, and the king gets very angry. So this must show that, in fact, you were not allowed to name people as such. And if we look at the Tel Fakhriya inscription, which Jonathan Falk mentioned, then, in fact, the king, as it were, the Malk, if you're looking at Aramaic, or also alternately, if we're speaking Akkadian, only the governor, has the name Adad Yisi, as we mentioned in Aramaic. However, in Akkadian, he gets the name Adad Ramani, which means, oh, Adad, help me, rather than Adad is my help. This is because if his name were translated directly, it would be Adad Nirari, the name of a king. So this would again be proof that this taboo was there the whole time, and hence this Ashur-uballit must be a king, however his title has been removed. So if we get to the end of this, and I'm sorry, I know this has been very taxing, but it's quite hard work proving the existence of kings, we have to work out when this king could have reigned. And if we narrow it down, it really has to be very soon before Tukulti-Ninurta II. Otherwise, there would be no reason to remove his inscription in this way and to not call him king. And so we have to say, could this Ashur-uballit then be the brother who Adad Nirari must have gotten rid of and smashed up the stele of? And there's actually a lot of evidence this would be the case, because the Assyrians seem to have had a fascination with the first Ashur-uballit, because he was a great early king, and in the order of kings, it would have made sense for the first son of Ashur-dan, who, by the way, commissioned various copies of the Assyrian king list, to name his successor, who was going to reconquer all of Assyria, Ashur-uballit. And then, mysteriously, the next one we have is Adad Nirari, who's the second great king of the Middle Assyrian period. So it feels like in between there should be an Ashur-uballit who's missing. Another point tied to this is that Adad Nirari II's behavior is very weird. He patronizes lots of non-Assyrian cults and does practically nothing for the Temple of Ashur, as far as I'm aware of, which is rather interesting, and it might be because the original statue we've seen, the destroyed statue, was put in the courtyard of Ashur, and so as a result, Adad Nirari had a bit of a bad relationship with the most important god in the Assyrian Empire, as we heard from Shenaziah this morning. So, if we pop him in and we go with it, we would have something like this. We'd have an extra Ashur-uballit, and so we'd have 3 brand new kings, and we're almost done, and goodness, we've hit 40 minutes. I've managed to do this much faster than I thought I was going to. So as a result, then we have to ask a last question. If we take all of my new kings as read, and as you've seen, there's quite solid evidence for each of them, at least in my opinion, it's enough evidence to prove that there would have been a Shalmaneser, so to speak, as I said at the beginning, by the agreement we always have previously. And so in this case, I'd say these new ones is probably enough evidence then to prove that there should be kings. And the question is, are there more? And the answer is yes. Briefly to gloss over very quickly, there's actually gaps which look like there could be 2 more people who at least tried to be king during this early New Assyrian period. And if we pop them all together, we get a family tree like that. So let's conclude. And here we have this lovely big panorama. These are, if we fill in all these new sort of kings and people who tried to be king, we end up with this here. And it's rather fun because all of a sudden, if you remember at the beginning, I gave you this very long succession of kings, one after another in a straight line where everything seemed to be organized. We see now that, in fact, it's much more realistic. Just like the Romans or any other successful empire, the elites were killing each other like mad, trying to become king. And please, this is not to impugn the Assyrian people whatsoever. It is the mark of a healthy empire, the same way as Rome or similar. No, people should be wanting to be king. They shouldn't be trying not to be king. And so from this, then, we end up with a new model to understand Assyria. This is the big spiel of my book. If you see, that's what I'm getting to at the end of all of this, namely that then competition and this sort of violence was actually part and parcel of how the Assyrian Empire worked and not unusual. It was actually very common. The unusual thing would be a period where no kings were trying to be killed or usurped by their brothers or uncles or cousins. So with that, I've hit 40 minutes, and it's my turn once again to thank the Assyrian Cultural Foundation, because, in fact, they have, as I've said, funded the open access of this lovely new history of Assyria I've written called Triumph and Betrayal. You've seen the betrayal part today. I talked about the triumph a bit more for my talk on Zoom in the early stages of this year. I think it was straight after Christmas. Anyway, you can see here, as a result, this is part of a new model that I suggest for how the Assyrian Empire worked, where at the top there are lots of kings trying to fight for each other, lots of pretenders to the throne trying to kill each other off or similar to become king, and a huge competitive society underneath in which kings, it was not about lording it over and being king. Sometimes it was about just trying to survive, just trying to make it through the first couple of years of your reign before you were killed. It seems as if you could last about 5 years an Assyrian king, then you were solid. You would make it through the rest of your reign until one of your children killed you. But until then, it was jolly good. All right, with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and Taudi, thank you for listening, and it's been a lovely conference. Thanks.